All right. This is Preventing Violence Educational, Part 7. And we're at Chapter 5. And the name of the chapter is How to Create Less Violent Societies. We're really getting to the meat of the issue. We discussed causes. Now, there was a shooting here in Detroit last week. Some police went to arrest someone who had killed some people over the 4th of July, and his buddy, while he was being arrested, his buddy pulled a gun and started shooting at the police, and subsequently was killed by the police himself. There was an outrage, even though the guy was armed and he, shot at the police. But this is a really good example of why this violence prevention information is so important, because a lot of people would say, well, he deserved it, he was shooting at the cops, or all these were druggies, they're selling drugs, so on and so forth. Okay, the thing is, no matter what it was that they did, there were underlying causes behind that. Why do a lot of inner city boys sell drugs? Because that's what there is to do. If they don't have a vehicle, they can't get out into the suburbs. Even if they do get out in the suburbs, who's going to hire them? They're less likely to be hired if they don't have a right education, if they haven't graduated high school. There's all these factors that, cause a person to be in this kind of situation where they would sell drugs, or they would kill someone, or they would feel like they have to carry a gun. So this is a perfect opportunity to take it back to source, to take it back to the foundation and the roots of what really has started all of this. Because you can say all day long, the person just didn't do the right thing, but you're not understanding the pressures and lack of resources, that they're dealing with in these kind of situations that bring a person to this point where they would feel like they have to do something like this. So now we're going to read about how to create less violent societies. And this is something that I think a lot of people really aren't understanding. They're not taking it back to the roots of the issue, or they'll say economic inequality, but it's very vague. So this kind of goes into detail. The first step towards learning how to prevent any health problem is to discover what causes it, so that we know what causes need to be removed or neutralized. That is why I discussed the causes of violence at such length in the previous chapters. Once we know the causes, we can apply that knowledge to the issue of prevention in a very direct way. We can stop causing it. We know how to cause violence by shaming people. Therefore, we know how to prevent it. Stop shaming them. That does not mean that we either can or should eliminate shame from the world, for the capacity to experience feelings of shame is as necessary as the capacity to experience physical pain. Just as physical pain signals to us that there is a threat to our physical health, so shame warns us that there is something lacking in our repertoire of social or cognitive skills and knowledge, some failure of development and maturation that needs further work. But unless we provide people with access to the means by which they can develop and mature further, such as education and employment, we leave them with no means other than violence of protecting themselves from potentially overwhelming and intolerable feelings of shame. We know how people shame other people, namely by treating them as inferior on an individual scale or by assigning them to an inferior social and economic status on a collective scale. Not everyone who is shamed in these ways will become violent, because most people have enough independent sources of self-esteem and self-respect to withstand even fairly intense disrespect from others. But if the goal is to start a fight, that is the one method that is most guaranteed to work with whoever is vulnerable to becoming violent. Thus, the first steps toward preventing violence consist of not shaming people, as by disrespecting them, and not depriving them of access to the tools they need in order to attain and maintain their self-respect, even when they're disrespected by others. So there has to be some other means here. If you are a male in our society and you don't have a job, you don't have a car, you don't have any means of upward mobility in our society, that is a constant 24/7 source of shame, whether you're consciously feeling that or it's on an unconscious level. The most important implication this has for the issue of preventing violence is that violence does not occur spontaneously. It occurs only when we cause it. So that the task of preventing violence does not so much require us to do something special as it requires us to stop doing the things we have been doing that cause violence. In other words, to discontinue the individual and social practices and behaviors that have been shown to cause violence. Once we stop causing violence, it will disappear by itself. That simple statement is not as optimistic as it may sound, however, because it is not at all clear how many of those things people will be willing to stop doing, even if they can be convinced that they cause violence. For preventing violence is not the only goal that many people value, and there are many other goals that some value more. As Elliot Curry wrote, we have the level of criminal violence we do because we have arranged our social and economic life in certain ways rather than others. The brutality and violence of American life are a signal that there are profound social costs to maintaining those arrangements. Money, 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 money. Ask the courts, ask the police. Ask the corporate interests. They know why they keep the game going. But by the same token, altering them also has a price. And if we continue to tolerate the conditions that have made us the most violent of industrial societies, it is not because the problem is overwhelmingly mysterious or because we did not know what to do, but because we have decided that the benefits of changing those conditions aren't worth the costs. And that source is Confronting Crime, 1985. It is very important to note, however, that the only segment of the population for whom changing our social and economic conditions in the ways that prevent violence would exact a higher cost would be the extremely wealthy upper or ruling class, the wealthiest 1% of the population, which in the United States today controls some 39% of the total wealth of the nation and 48% of the financial wealth, as shown by Wolf and Top Heavy, 1996, and I'm sure the numbers are much greater now that it's 2020. The other 99% of the population, namely the middle class and the lower class, would benefit not only from decreased rates of violence, which primarily victimize the very poor, but also from a more equitable distribution of the collective wealth and income of our unprecedentedly wealthy societies. Even on a worldwide scale, it would require a remarkably small sacrifice from the wealthiest individuals. They wouldn't even feel it. They could throw money up in the air all day long at you, and they would never feel it. They're that fucking rich. They're so rich they don't know what to do with their fucking money, but they don't want to spend it on making anything better. Or they want to act like they're spending it on making things better by donating to charities and what the fuck ever. Okay. Including the populations of the poorest nations above the subsistence level. I'm going to repeat this. Even on a worldwide scale, it would require a remarkably small sacrifice from the wealthiest individuals and nations to raise everyone on earth, including the populations of the poorest nations above the subsistence level, as the United Nations Human Development Report 1998 has shown. I emphasize the wealthiest individuals as well as nations because, as the UN report documents, a tiny number of the wealthiest individuals actually possess wealth on a scale that is larger than the annual income of most of the nations of the earth. For example, the 3 richest individuals on earth have assets that exceed the combined gross domestic product of the 48 poorest countries. The assets of the 84 richest individuals exceed the gross domestic product of the most populous nation on earth, China, with 1.2 billion inhabitants. The 225 richest individuals have a combined wealth of over 1 trillion, which is equal to the annual income of the poorest 47% of the world's population, or 2.5 billion people. Now, in the age of COVID-19, corporations and individuals that were already very wealthy have gotten even more wealthy due to the virus and small businesses being shut down and not being able to reopen. So if you think about the concentration of wealth, not only in this country, but in all the rich people in the world, and how easily and quickly these ills of society of the masses could be fixed. How quickly and easily. It is just disgusting that they don't. It really is. It has been shown throughout the world, both internationally and internationally, that reducing economic inequities not only improves physical health and reduces the rate of death from natural causes far more effectively than doctors, medicines, and hospitals, it also decreases the rate of death from both criminal and political violence far more effectively than any system of police forces, prisons, or military interventions ever invented. And this is a statistically proven fact, because we've been doing things the way we've been doing them for a long time. And is it changing anything? No, it's not. So, time for a change. If you're beating your head against the wall doing the same old thing, that's insane. And insanity is doing the same thing expecting a different result. So let's appeal to those that we can to make changes, and let's try to make changes as we can. And there's two ways to do that: by lifting up of income and by reduction of expenses. And that's the route that I took when taking over my house, was reduction of expenses, because to live beyond your means is just futile. It's a never-ending battle. You never win. You're constantly stressed out. You're constantly in survival mode. And by the way, when you're in survival mode, you're operating from the reptilian brain, which means your higher thinking is pretty much cut off. If you want to look it up, there literally is scientific proof. When you are stressed and you're in fight and flight all the time, your higher brain functions are not able to operate properly. You're in survival mode. You're ticked off, you're anxious, you're fearful, you're worried, so on and so forth. It may seem obvious that violence can be caused, but what reason do we have to think that it can be prevented? One reason for believing that is because it is already being prevented or has been prevented in all those nations, cultures, and periods of history that have lower rates of violence than other nations or epochs. My goal in writing this book is simply to make sure that all who read it will learn which choices lead to more violence and which ones to less. So what works and what doesn't. So that whatever choices they make will at least be made with full knowledge of the costs and benefits. Now I'm going to skip this section on social and political democracy. Other than saying that there are some societies who have instituted social democracy, or welfare states as they're sometimes called, and achieved an unprecedented decrease in the inequities in wealth and income between the richest and poorest groups in the population, one effect of which is to reduce the frequency of interpersonal or criminal violence. Germany, Japan, and Italy are examples of these countries. Wars and governments have always caused far more homicides than all the individual murderers put together. While the United States adopted political democracy at its inception, it is the only developed nation on earth that has never adopted social democracy, a welfare state. The United States alone among the developed nations does not provide universal health insurance for all its citizens. It has the highest rate of relative poverty among both children and adults, and the largest gap between the rich and the poor of any of the major economies. Vastly less adequate levels of unemployment insurance and other components of shared responsibility for human welfare, and so on. Thus, it is not surprising that it also has murder rates that have been 5 to 10 times higher as those of any other developed nation year after year. For instance, Canada is across the river, Windsor. They have just as many guns. They have just as many people in the city as they do here. They leave their doors unlocked over there. Their crime rate is almost zero compared to our crime rate, and it's just across the river. So what is the difference? The difference is they have safety nets in place to prevent pressure and lack of resources and shame. Another reason for concluding violence can be prevented, and that we know how to do so, can be found by contrasting the effects of the peace settlement that occurred after the First World War with that which followed the Second. As well known, the Versailles Treaty that the Allied powers imposed on Germany following the end of World War I included not only a statement condemning Germany, but also a series of financial penalties so punitive that they would have been ruinous had they been fully enforced. The effect of this was to give the right-wing revanchists, of whom Hitler emerged as the leader, an invaluable propaganda tool, namely the ability to win the elections on the campaign promise to undo the shame of Versailles, i.e. the humiliation to which the Allies had subjected Germany. In fact, even before Hitler entered politics, the great British economist John Maynard Keynes, who was delegate at the peace conference, saw how destructive the terms of the Versailles settlement would be to the prospect for future peace, so he resigned in protest and wrote an angry denunciation of it, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, in which he predicted much of what later happened. The point is simply that if one wants peace, then humiliating and punishing one's former enemy is not the way to reach that goal. I'm going to repeat that. The point is simply, if one wants peace, then humiliating and punishing one's former enemy is not the way to reach that goal. For, among other things, it only strengthens the hand of people like Hitler who already want revenge and will gladly use any pretext to get it. Okay, lessons we ourselves can learn from the difference between the results of the two peace settlements is not only that violence can be prevented, but that the worst form of violence can be prevented, namely world war. After the end of World War II, the Allies, far from humiliating the three Axis powers or punishing them financially by ordering them to pay reparations for their war crimes, actually extended financial support to them to help them rebuild their economies after the devastation of the war, and helped them also to establish stable political, democratic institutions for the first time. The result has been more than 50 years of unbroken peace on what had been the bloodiest continent in human history during the previous 30 years. And I'm going to repeat this one more time because the dynamic that's going on in our country right now with shame is so detrimental, and a lot of people think that if you call that out, that it's a racist thing, and that you believe that things should continue on this way, which they should not. Really, it comes down to what works and what doesn't. Okay, if one wants peace, then humiliating and punishing one's former enemy is not the way to reach that goal. So, for all of those in our society who feel oppressed or feel that their ancestors have been oppressed, which they have, it's not a denial to say that if one wants peace, then humiliating and punishing one's former enemy is not the way to reach that goal. This is literally just what works and what doesn't work, right? It has to do with the dynamics of what actually works and not wanting to continue to oppress or wanting to ignore what has happened in the past. It has nothing to do with that. It just has to do with, does this work or not? And it turns out that humiliating and punishment and shame does not work. And I think that that's why some of this stuff is cropping up right now in our society, because when people are forced to hide the way that they feel about other people, it's going to come out in some way or another. And you see it coming out in these very racist attacks and rants on social media and by these racist groups that are coming out of the woodwork literally everywhere. I'm going to read it one more time. It's so very important. And no matter which side of the line you're standing on, this is what does not work. And it's proven that this is what does not work. The point is simply that if one wants peace, then humiliating and punishing one's former enemy is not the way to reach that goal. For among other things, it only strengthens the hand of people like Hitler and other racist people who already want revenge and will gladly use any pretext to get it. Okay? So either you want peace or you don't. Now, there's some societies here that he's describing. Most of them are not first world societies. And some of them probably don't even exist anymore, so I am going to skip that part. Okay, I will read this part here. Gibson in Haas, The Anthropology of War, 1990, describes a non-violent city, the Buid, a highland group in Mindoro, the Philippines, who reject any form of violence, aggression, or even competition. Their economic system is based on equal sharing of wealth. Their political system eliminates competition for power and prestige, and they have an ideology of ascribed equality. People are considered equal, no matter how successful they are in various activities. They disapprove of boastfulness, quarreling, and attempts to dominate others, which they see as leading to violence and murder. To the Buid Masag, aggressive behavior connotes everything of negative value in social life, and they regard it as typical of their lowland Christian and Muslim antagonists, both of whom have a historical tradition of exploiting the Buid through trading, raiding, and enslaving, whom they hold up as a negative example. Interestingly, the Muslims place a directly opposite value on that same concept. To them, May-Sug refers to all that is positively valued in men: virility, courage, and the ability to stand up for one's honor. And just as the two groups place opposite values on aggression, so they do on courage, fear, and flight. The Buid, by contrast, have no word for courage, in the sense of a positively valued aggressive attitude in the face of physical danger. There are many words for fear and flight from danger, neither of which is seen as being reprehensible. Indeed, they are the only rational responses to danger. They do not fight wars, and while even their extraordinarily anti-aggressive value system does not render them completely immune from lethal violence, the only known homicide in a 10-year period was committed by an atypical eccentric who had a fearsome reputation as a sorcerer. Perhaps no social system can guarantee absolute protection from the occasional isolated deviant, and we see this with school shootings and mass murders. Finally, I will refer back to the cross-cultural statistics summarized in Chapter 2 with reference to the causes of violence. Since there is a reciprocity between causation and prevention, those same statistics show the conditions that prevent violence. These are economic and political egalitarianism, with classless societies, no slavery or social castes, and minimal hierarchicalization in the political sphere, and relative freedom from the invidious display of wealth, boasting, sensitivity to insults, and other social and cultural characteristics that tend to stimulate shame, envy, and violence. Namely, competition in our society. We have this stupid, fucked up idea that survival of the fittest at all costs is the way, and it is not. That was cherry-picked out of a book by Darwin. In that book, and I'll let you do your own research, in that book, he says the word love like over 90 times, and also talks about cooperative dynamics in nature. But this one sentence about survival of the fittest is what was cherry-picked out of the text and has become this excuse for people to do whatever they want to other people because may the best man win. And so this competition is promulgated in our society, and it goes all the way from the top all the way down to schoolyard brawls and classrooms and siblings. I mean, there is an amount of, sibling rivalry and competition that's healthy. And I think we do see examples of that in our society, of healthy competition. But this brutalization, this excuse for brutalization, in the name of survival of the fittest, is wrong. And I encourage you to do your research on it. It's not what everybody says that it is. Nature is inherently cooperative. It really is. And there's some other research you can do. There is a documentary called I Am that describes this perfectly. Okay. What is extraordinary about the range of cultures we have discussed so far in this chapter is that for all their variety, ranging from modern post-industrial economies to Anabaptist communal farming communities to the most primitive, non-literate hunting and gathering societies, that they have two things in common. In all of them, wealth and political power are shared unusually equitably, and they all have remarkably reduced rates of violence. It would appear that social and political egalitarianism, democracy, actual democracy and not fake democracy, serves to diminish both shame and violence quite effectively across a wide range of differing levels of overall economic and cultural development. So we don't need to be a carbon copy of another country in order to right the rudder on this. In Chapter 2, we reviewed evidence that unemployment tends to stimulate violence. And boy, are we in a spot with this COVID-19 where unemployment is and will continue to stimulate violence. It is noteworthy that as the rates of unemployment decline, the rates of violence tend to do so as well. Since violence is multi-determined, the effect of any one variable, such as the unemployment rate, can of course be augmented or diminished by the simultaneous effect of other variables, such as the level of unemployment insurance that is provided. And this is why a second stimulus is so important, especially with winter coming. There's the second wave of COVID-19 that's going through the population. And in the meantime, things are opening up. And that is so that the economic crash isn't as bad. But at the same time, it's going to be worse off down the line. And the cold weather's coming. So you got your stimulus check in the spring. You know, you're making it through the summer. But what are you going to do in the wintertime? And if there's no more money coming, if you can't find a job, how are you going to keep your utilities on? How are people not going to freeze to death? How are people not going to be homeless in the streets by the millions? These are things that we're looking at right now. And I really, really, really feel that is why this is so pertinent to understand. Therefore, the high unemployment rates currently seen in many European countries have still not translated into rates of violence remotely as high as those that are seen in the United States, because the social safety net protecting workers from falling into poverty is so much more secure in Europe than it is in the United States. But it is not just the effects of unemployment that can be affected by governmental action. So can the rate of unemployment. For example, for many years in the United States, the Federal Reserve Board has intervened to raise the unemployment rate whenever the danger arose that it might get too low. Think about that. I'm going to read it again. The Federal Reserve Board has intervened to raise the unemployment rate whenever the danger arose that it might get too low. So you have this system that's supposed to be working for you that's actually working against you. Given the effect this can have on the rates of homicide and suicide, and the efforts of other branches of the government to lower the homicide rate, it is clear that different branches of the government have been working at cross purposes. Duh. One does not have to assume that the Federal Reserve Board was deliberately trying to keep the murder rates as high as possible, and I do not assume that in order to note that they could hardly have done anything more effective to that end. Conversely, now that the Federal Reserve Board has finally allowed the unemployment rate to reach a 30-year low, the murder rate's finally fallen slightly below the epidemic levels of the past 30 years, which this was back in 2000, so obviously that's not the case anymore. To the extent that we care about the level of violence in our society, however, it is important to do everything in our power to keep the unemployment rate as low as possible, ideally to provide full employment for everyone able to work, as Roosevelt attempted during the Depression, and at least not actually cause unemployment. If there is an unavoidable minimum of unemployment, we must try to mitigate the humiliating effects of not being able to find a job, such as providing enough unemployment insurance to prevent poverty. Gender roles and homophobia. The discussion of gender roles and homophobia in chapters 2 and 3 has implications for the prevention of violence that I want to emphasize here, because I think that it has not usually been noticed or acknowledged that decisions we make on these issues can have an impact on the level of violence in our society. The general principle here is clear. Anything that will reduce the artificial and exaggerated polarization of gender roles and the irrational fear, hatred, and contempt felt and expressed towards homosexuals will help to prevent violence, because those are among the main causes of violence, and not only or even primarily towards women or gays. In line with my contention that we simply need to stop doing the things we are doing that cause violence, it is relevant to notice that there are now several areas in our public life in which major institutions are actively supporting gender asymmetry and discrimination against homosexuals. The military still has arbitrary rules that vary people's access to military roles based on their gender or sexual orientation, rather than the basis of their individual abilities and wishes. These rules are made by governments, which in a democracy means all of us collectively, and can be repealed by governments. Traditionally, only men were conscripted against their will into the military, and even after women were allowed to join the military voluntarily, participation in combat was restricted more or less exclusively to men. Both these practices help to maintain the traditional gender role asymmetries that stimulate and perpetuate violence in society. Some religious sects restrict access to membership in the clergy, and in some cases to membership in the congregation based on gender or sexual orientation. While it is not appropriate for the government to repeal these rules, the religious bodies themselves can. Nothing could give more support to the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." In debates over these issues, it is seldom noticed that they are relevant to the issue of preventing violence. In my discussion of these issues, I am attempting to focus on actions that could be taken, or rather violence-provoking policies that could be discontinued, by people in positions of power, in the government, the military, the churches, and the synagogues and mosques, and so on. I'm trying to find the strategic levers in society that influence people's attitudes on a mass scale. The major public institutions of our society serve as the moral teachers of the public. The values that they express through their rules and behaviors cannot help but influence the private behavior of the millions of people who respect those institutions and look to them for guidance as to how to live with other people. And this is where white supremacy and the framework of white supremacy and the acknowledgement and awareness of the framework of white supremacy in our society is so powerful and important to understand. And I'm going to read this again for that very reason. The major public institutions of our society serve as the moral teachers of the public. The values that they express through their rules and behaviors cannot help but influence the private behavior of the millions of people who respect those institutions and look to them for guidance as to how to live with other people. And this is whether consciously or unconsciously, because these are things that are conditioned into us from birth. They are conditioned by our parents, our friends, our schools, our general public where we go out to shop, commercials. I mean, it's built into everything. And that's why this has been such a huge issue. And it does need to be changed. It absolutely needs to be changed, but it doesn't need to be changed while pointing fingers at other people as individuals and saying, you are the cause of this, because we are not, as individuals, the cause of it. If you're growing up in a collective society, you're going to have influences. And those influences are going to affect you whether you want them to affect you or not. The only difference is if your awareness level is higher, if you've educated yourself, if you've done research, if you've said to yourself, this doesn't really feel right, or I don't really like the way this is going, and you start to question this framework and these conditioned practices in our society. And you start to pick it apart and start to say, okay, this has been affecting me and this has been affecting everybody, whether or not we even knew that we were being affected by it. You're brought into these systems, you're born into these systems without having any control over changing them. And that only happens as you become an adult. And by that time, people are pointing the finger at you saying, this is your fault. It is not your fault, okay? It is the fault of our collective society, and especially of the government, which is holding these things into place and continuing to perpetuate them. But the average individual who is not an abject racist is not responsible. What they are responsible for is their level of awareness, the research that they do to gain more awareness, and the choices that they make from that point on. So, and then this is why when we're dealing with children especially, we say, racism isn't something that you're born feeling. It's something that you're taught. Violence toward children. Among other policies that would prevent violence, in which it is in the power of governments to adopt, eliminating legally permitted or even mandated violence toward children would be high on my list. It is time for every country on earth to follow Sweden and the other Northern European countries in declaring it illegal for an adult to strike a child. Children sometimes need to be physically restrained, and this is part of what our society is fucked up with, because you're not allowed to restrain a child, but you're allowed to spank a child, when actual restraint would be a better, wiser choice. Children sometimes need to be physically restrained, for example, if they're running into traffic, assaulting another child, or will not respond to words alone. But one never needs to strike a child in order to restrain him or for any other reason. We know that the more children are hit, the more they hit others, and we know that the more they are disciplined with love-oriented techniques and verbal reasoning, the less violently they themselves behave, both as children and as adults. And this is science that's backing this up. So there's what works and there's what doesn't work. And there's what works in the moment and what feels like it's working in the moment, but what actually ends up causing more problems later on. Naturally, it goes without saying that even more extreme forms of physical violence toward children, such as genital mutilation and capital punishment, or charging children as adults, they are not. Their brains are not finished developing. They are subjected to influences and forces in the adult world that they do not understand. And to punish a child as an adult is just wrong. It is wrong, which is why juvenile lifers are considered unconstitutional in the state of Michigan, for example. The UK, like every other Western democracy except the US, has abolished capital punishment for all ages. Many other countries prescribe the death penalty for adults, but the US is one of only 6 nations on earth today that still executes children as young as 16. Clearly, discontinuing this policy would end one practice that is a statement to every parent and child in the country that it is morally and legally permissible to express disapproval of children by killing them. Restricting media violence is a big thing too. One paradox in current censorship is that we are much more active about restricting access to sexual content than to depictions of violence. Apparently, there's a consensus that it is acceptable to allow children to see people murdering or assaulting each other in the most brutal fashion on a daily basis, whereas it would be morally shocking and unacceptable to allow them to see 2 people making love. I'm not arguing that either kind of program or film is appropriate for a child, but the distinction we are making here seems to say that murder as entertainment is acceptable, but sex is not. Why should we allow children to watch violence when we do not allow them to watch erotica? Definitive end to the production and distribution of this pornography of violence will only occur when people stop wanting to watch it, and that only when they are well educated enough and emotionally secure and mature enough to recognize the difference between mindless mayhem and thoughtful and moving drama. All right, I have to go to work now, so I'm going to finish this chapter in the next section on preventing violence educational. It's actually quite a long chapter also. So I'm going to end this for now. Please watch my next video on preventing violence educational part 8. And thank you so much for tuning in. And I hope that you got a lot from this video and that you'll continue to watch. Thank you.